This is a hard book to talk about because these two guys are, well, one of them wrote the book, both of them lived through it. So I guess the best thing to do is since we have the author here, is to ask him, maybe just give us sort of the treetops version of what this book's about. That way, then we can get into it and talk about the various things. Because there's a great deal in this book that's rich and fascinating, funny, coincidental.
And all true.
There you go.
True story.
So what happens?
Yeah, in essence, in the summer of '68, I was a excruciatingly self-conscious. You're okay?
Well, I just no point in moving around.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. 17-year-old, and I was surviving my oppressive all-boys prep school in Toronto, and my warring nuclear family, and my grandmother decided to send me on this trip to Europe called the Odyssey, which was baby boomers from across Canada, 13 girls, 13 boys, and Volkswagen buses, 1968. You know, sex, drugs, rock and roll was all bursting out. It was a culture shock for me. It was, you know, Queen Victoria meets Jimi Hendrix. And on the trip, I met this 18-year-old girl, Sally Woodhouse, who I had known as a child and did not see for 6 or 7 years. And all of a sudden, she's appearing on this trip, and I'm smitten. And over the first few days of the trip, all she talks about is her boyfriend, George Orr, who I did not know, but I heard about was a bearded, brilliant 21-year-old, right, being groomed for greatness. I was going to be prime minister one day, and I am, intimidated, of course. But as the trip wore on, we grew closer together, and you can imagine Europe in '68 and the nightclubs and the music and the Rolling Stones, and it was very powerful. And I was nurturing fantasies of stealing Sally from George.
But you'd actually met her when you were kids, right?
Actually, the first girl I ever had erotic feelings for when I was 11 up at Lake Simcoe. There she was, and that adrenal rush, and I went, oh, this is what everyone's talking about. Right? So she was the first object of desire. And I didn't, as I say, I didn't see her for 6 years. So this was the thing, like all boys school, girls were a foreign species. And that's why she was sort of a charged, as George went to the same school, so we had the same kind of background. So this is part of the story. And so on the trip, we become inseparable, and there's just kind of obviously a triangulated tension because I'm completely aware of George back in Toronto. But what I didn't know and would not learn for another 30 years was until George told me in 1998 that before the trip, 6 months before the trip, in Christmas '67, he woke from this incredibly powerful and compelling dream in which he wakes from the dream, Sally will be killed in Europe this summer. And George can talk about this, but he was convinced this was true and told Sally and told her parents and told his parents and told his friends and begged her not to go on the trip. And she was 18 and indestructible, and of course she was going to go on the trip. And a very intense time. And then I meet her on the trip, and it's an 8-week party, really, and Renaissance art, and it was just very, very powerful for teenagers. And then George, back in Toronto, of course, can't bear the tension of this, and only 2 weeks to go before she's home, and he, in a panic, fires off a telegram to our hotel in Germany, in Rudesheim. Will you marry? I love you. Will you marry me? And she said yes. And when I found out, I burst into tears because I was 17 going on 11. And the trance broke in that moment. And then this is what is so powerful about the story. Just hours later, she was killed in a freak accident, fulfilling the dream. So it's a kind of Orpheus legend. And that's what there would be no book without this aspect of the story. I mean, it had obviously affected us both, her death, but I didn't think there was a book in it necessarily until 1998 when George told me about the dream.
So George, when you, when was the first time that you guys met? Was it in Toronto after you guys came back, and I guess you were at the Woodhouse house for sitting, what wasps call it, but I guess Jews call it sitting Shiva.
Yes.
We call it drinking till you fall over. There's a spiritual component.
And that's my understanding is from the book, you don't remember meeting him the first time, do you?
I have a vague recollection. There was a group of them. They'd collected somewhere in North Toronto weeks after this, and
Well, it was Degrassi Point.
oh,
when I met
that's
you.
right. That's right. Yeah, that's yeah.
Up at the Lake Simcoe where I first met Sally.
Yeah. Her parents had a cottage in this astoundingly lovely compound of upper Canadian crust with beautiful waterfront. That's right. Yeah,
That's right. And you were on Thorazine, I think.
I was very not present.
Yes.
As I recall.
Yeah.
I was.
I do describe that in the book of going there at just turned 18, and you were in the corner, and I don't think you uttered a word to me. I didn't blame you. And her parents were trying to get me to talk about the trip, and I was babbling on and on and on about Sally, right? Yeah. And then I realized, oh my God, like her parents wanted to hear about their daughter, but George doesn't want to hear about me.
So did you, when they were in Europe, did you know about him?
Mm-hmm.
And he obviously had feelings about you and jealousy, obviously. Was he a threat to this engagement that you had
Well, you
cultivated?
didn't really know about me, did you?
I was, and I'm still really self-conscious about this, but I'll get over it someday. I was so altered by the trauma of what was going to happen that all I knew was bad shit is going to land on my head. So I didn't know about him specifically. I just knew something was going to happen, and I never figured out if it was actually precognition or the angst of a young man hopelessly in love with somebody he's going to lose or what. But it was, so my ability to distinguish between anything and anything else at that point was just about zero.
But you'd written Sally throughout the trip, and that's what's remarkable in the book, is that George gives James these letters that George and Sally had exchanged.
All summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was that like for you to read?
Well, that was again the seed of the book, because I was writing my last book, What Disturbs Our Blood, which is a very intense family memoir with trauma in that, and it was actually Nan, who was on the Odyssey, who was here, we had our 40th reunion of the trip on Salt Spring Island, and Nan said, you're a published author, James, and are you going to do the Sally story? Because I had known the dream at this point, and I was very hesitant to do so because I know how it haunted George, and so finally I got ambivalent, and I finally contacted you by email and said, what do you think? Should we wade into this? And I came out here to Vancouver, and I went to your house in North Vancouver, and we sat in the basement for 3 hours, and we kicked it around, and then this dramatic moment, which is at the beginning of the book, where I'm going to leave, and there's a box of letters sitting there in the basement, and George takes the top letter off and says, this is the last letter Sally wrote me in August '68. And it was too painful that I couldn't read it, and he hands it to me. And I'm thinking, this is the beginning of a book. Okay, right? That becomes the opening scene in the book. And then the next week you sent me all of the letters, and so there's this great act of bravery and emotional risk, and trust me, we're both journalists, but are we going to go the distance on this? And I think that the turning point came when George's daughter, Lily, who was 26 at the time, George was very torn. A book can heal, but a book can re-traumatize, and are we going to really do this? And I was completely sympathetic to this. We don't have to do this. I'm serious. And apparently George showed my email to his daughter, Lily, who was 20, and she said, Dad, you're a journalist, and you expect people to open up to you. So what goes around comes around. Your turn. And that's what really was decisive, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
So when you look back at these letters, it's a great sketch into how young people 50 years ago communicated with one another. The letter, how would you describe them? They're cheesy, they're romantic, they're all that, right?
They're intense, they're banal, they're real,
This is my writing you're talking about.
No, go on. Actually, somebody said to me, not yours, somebody said to me quite honestly the other day, he said, Sally's letters are quite banal, a lot of them. And I said, well, and then he paused and he said, I think that's because she was loved for who she was.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing, because she was comfortable in her own skin, she was natural, she wasn't a classical beauty, but she was full of life and knew who she was. and we didn't. And we were, intense young men and trying to prove something, and that's why I think we were drawn to her for that. Similar reasons.
So she's on the cover of the book, which you see there at the entrance, Dreaming Sally. If they made a movie about this, who would play her? I asked you this before.
Yes.
I'm sure.
If Molly Ringwald were 18 again, I think she'd be my first choice. Yeah, she had reddish hair and a slightly upturned upper lip, and like a raspy voice, and tomboyish. As you described her as a tomboy and a bombshell at once. Yeah.
What was she like? Because when did you meet her, George?
I spent the summer of 1966 in a mining camp just south of the Arctic Ocean, working for not much, building as a carpenter. I came home a grizzled young, having had work experience in the world, to go back to private school, and was set up on a double date with this young woman. Her dad was the Rosedale doctor. He was the head of the health services at U of T, so he had 75,000 students under his medical purview. And I showed up on his doorstep, and he was the most intimidating man you can imagine. My daughter was one of them. And I had to stand up to this guy, and I had no idea where I got the courage, but I stood up to Dr. George, and we got along begrudgingly
His
well.
name was George, by the way.
Yeah, he was a George, and I was a George, and he couldn't intimidate me for reasons that I never understood, and I didn't think I took him seriously. Now that I have a daughter, I understand. And I was an outsider. This was the upper crust of Upper Canada. Rosedale, sort of the heart of genteel, astoundingly old, lovely money. And I was wheedling my way into their daughter's life and into their life. And once they realized they couldn't get rid of me, they sort of put up with me. And I would go to the cottage, and I would be part of dinner, and I would meet their friends. And
Sure. But you both have backgrounds where you came from that sort of family life, right? I mean, your father and your grandfather were in the insurance business.
Yeah.
Your father and your grandfather were
The medical
doctors, yeah.
business. Yeah.
So it's obviously a very different world that I'm used to, that I know. But what's fascinating is the upbringing that you both had prevented you from, say, expressing feelings, and as we read at the beginning of the book, mourning even. So I mean, would you tell us about just how repressive that was and what that did to say two guys who were growing up in these very formative years?
I mean, I think this is why I realize that I understand it much better now, but 10 years ago, it was like, this was the kind of final expression of my three books. This is a trilogy, and that my first two books on Upper Canada College and my family was about these themes. So my life has been, on the one hand, yes, I was born into a privileged class in Toronto. My grandfather was an eminent man who founded the Connaught Laboratories and made insulin for Banting and Best, and was an international superstar in public health and wiped out diphtheria, and was a remarkable guy, and kills himself when he's 57 at the height of his success. And this is a secret. And so many, many other secrets pile on top of that. Sexual abuse at Upper Canada College, my first book. So all of these themes were an undercurrent to my life, pre-Sally and during Sally. When I knew Sally, I didn't know any of this stuff consciously, but there was a writer being born here, right? That these themes, and that as I was writing the Sally book, this was the coda that at the end of the book it was hitting me. This is why I'm doing this. That all of these things that happened in my life, my brother's sexual abuse at age 3 and 4 and 5, my grandfather's suicide, my father's attempts at suicide, these very eminent, privileged people, and Sally's death. These things are inherently traumatic and tragic, but what really got my attention about as a writer why I went after this stuff was, it's the response, or better put, the lack of response to these events. And that this is the part of the class aspect of this, that this is more British than the British. Make this stuff disappear now. And it was very effective. It worked for the short term. It would have killed me. I can say that now with all sincerity, if I had not gone after this. So writing together with very good therapists and talk therapy and dreaming and all of that stuff. That saved my life. And George in some way was similarly at risk. I mean, my family stuff is a little more intense than yours, but we were grappling with essentially the same forces here. So people looking in on our lives, you can understand how they would see us and envy us from the outside. Wow, those guys have got it made, you know? And that's always been a problem for us, because if we start to protest this, it's like, you're a whining little privileged prep boy. And rather than, I have a writer with something serious to say about class and power and childhood and child rearing and so on.
But George, I've known George for a while now. He's one of my closest friends. I mean, you've always been a sort of pain in the ass for people, and I suppose
Sweet.
so I'm assuming that you learned early on, 18, 19, 20, 21, especially at the point where you find out that this girl that you're engaged to has died, that you needed to get away from this, otherwise it would have destroyed your life as well.
Hi Mike. Thanks for coming. I'm a post where I'm a baby boomer. A lot of us here are. I grew up in a place of considerable privilege. I was the last in a series of Georges that went to this private school. The first one went in 1840.
And they're all named George.
We are a collection of Georges, most of us dead. And I recall the day I was taken to that school by my father when I was, I think, 7. We walked onto the grounds and my stomach got into a knot. I went there under protest. I left before I was finished. I wanted out of that milieu. I mean, if I had stayed in that milieu, I would have been a lawyer, I suspect. I would have drank a lot. I would have married well. We would have had a dog and probably kids, and I wouldn't have lived this long. But I would have lived in that box, and I spent my whole life trying to get out of that box, not knowing how, until she died. And literally within 2 or 3 minutes of her dying, I realized, I'm out of the box. I get to do whatever I want now. I did it out of tragedy, but I was free, whereas he was stuck.
And so you came out west,
Damn right.
but you decided to stay and fight your corner.
Yeah,
I think that's what you say in the book, right?
I was in a trance for most of my 20s and 30s, and then I realized as my relationships were failing, that was the wake-up call. My father's suicidality. I mean, I had to face the music. I was trying to avoid it for a long time, as young men do. I'm okay, I'm fine. And then that was a kind of life and death or decision that I had to stand and fight. So we both dealt with the same thing in different ways, but we did deal with it.
I guess the common thread between these two guys is that James found solace or comfort in writing. You did in journalism, George. I asked you this when I interviewed you when the book came out for my podcast. The writing itself, because you've written about your father's father. You've written about Upper Canada College, this repressive school that you went to. Now this love of your life that this unrequited love, I should say, that ends. Are you better for writing?
That's a fascinating question. It was almost a question of necessity. I mean, again, I had an epiphany at the end of the book when I was asking myself, why am I torturing myself? Because I do not find writing easy. I find it painstakingly difficult. I'm too much of a perfectionist, and that comes from that school where they're over your shoulder and correcting your grammar every 5 minutes. And I would cry at one spelling mistake, when I'm 10. And so I was top in English, but I paid this terrible price. It was a fear-driven situation, and so I people think I'm a very good writer, but that's been the therapy for me. I think is like events like this. People, when they respond to my books, they say, "Oh, you're such a great writer," and my tendency was always to look over my shoulder and who are you talking to? Because I've dissociated from my own achievement in some ways. And that's changed, thank God, over time. But you see what I'm saying? That writing became a kind of, because I was almost semi-autistic as a child, I didn't speak. We had similar mothers. Both of our mothers, this is where we went deeper into the book as we challenged each other, had postpartum depressions when we were born. George's grandfather died 12 days before, his name was George, died 12 days before you were born, right? And my mother had a postpartum depression because she was overwhelmed by my older sister Sheila. My mother didn't know how to be a mother, but had to pretend and act. And so she, ultimately sympathetic to her. Of course, I understood her better later. But here's a woman in 1950 who doesn't know what to do and is completely isolated and alone. Doesn't know how to, she didn't pick us up, she didn't kiss us, she didn't read us bedtime stories, she didn't touch us, and this, I had to pay a price for this because I retreated completely into myself in the nursery and got over-invested in writing. So I became precocious as a little child, and I would write my mother's stories. It's in the book, right? I found, when my mother died, I found a short story that I wrote my letter when I was 6. And I had this epiphany that, that's what writing became the tool to dig out of this hole. I had to reach my mother somehow, almost like a life and death struggle to stay alive in some way, psychologically. And so my mother saved this little story, but I don't think she really understood it. Because I'm writing about a trip to the moon in this, I'm 6 years old, I'm talking about there's no food or air on Earth. So I want to go to the moon thinking there's food and air on the moon. And there isn't. The rocket boy, as it's called, and it comes back. So after my mother died, I found the story and it hit me, this realization about what writing was for me and why, because I was puzzled why it was so hard for me, and yet I still kept doing it. And then I realized it's about my mother. And so the idea of giving up writing became a very attractive idea that, that's the sadness I feel, that I didn't diversify into other forms of expression, like film or acting, or that I could have done those things. There's still time, and doing this and the oral aspect of this is what I actually prefer now. Believe me, I'd much rather do this. This is lovely, than write. I really mean that. Yeah.
What George, for you, that upbringing, and then the fact that you came all the way to the West Coast, you went as far west as you could to Tofino, I understand, right? Mm-hmm. Did that influence, how you became a parent? How you were as a parent, I should say?
I never, how do I put this? I was wound so tight. Actually, I want to thank my friend Chester Grant for saving my life one day. Yep. I was wound so tight, I had shoved so much stuff away that I had never acknowledged, never dealt with rage and anger. Chester and I one day were in the company of our compadre Keith. And Keith had taken offense to something I had done and took a strip off of me. And I was actually going to kill him. I knew in my soul this man was going to die at my hands. Just this rage just flew out of me. And without knowing it, Chester took me out and we walked down the street and he talked me down. And I would have done damage, like I had so much shit shoveled away. It was this exercise, I think, and falling in love with my sweetheart that finally enabled me to get out of all that. But I put a lot of stuff away. And I was quite terrified by it on occasion. So I turned to diversions to not deal for a long time. And then he showed up.
So you really got involved in this project, what, 20 years ago?
Not in earnest still till
No.
10 years ago.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I remember I had lunch with you just before the book came out, and you were, I don't know if worried is the right word about how the book would be perceived. What were some of the conversations that you had? Because you were asking a lot of him.
Yes.
Even though you're the author.
Yeah.
His participation was key for your book. Were a lot of, say, his fears about how the book would come out or how it would turn out? Were there a lot of discussions between the two of you on that?
Yes, and there still are. It's a fascinating process because it's not over in a sense. Like this book is kind of a living organism.
It's a sequel.
Well, when it's set loose, I suppose, in terms of conversations, and there is no, we hate that word closure.
There is no closure.
Right? So,
There is no closure.
and so this was a fascinating part of this, is the meta story, right? That for I guess 4 or 5 years we talked back and forth for hundreds of hours on the phone and in person, and we were kind of challenging each other. And this was the creative tension between us was, initially I was feeling guilty, if that's the right word, of kind of co-opting George's voice, that
Good.
you know, that it was his story as much as mine. Now, whose story is this? Now it's ultimately mine because it's my book and my name on it, but it's my autobiography, I suppose. But I kept saying to George, "How about you write a chapter and I write a chapter?" You know? And he kept saying no. And so I'm diligently writing down these evocative phrases and memories because he's got a wonderful memory and as you know, he's obviously articulate, and he's a professional journalist on radio and TV, has a gift for visual metaphor, and so I'm writing down these quite powerful phrases, and I'm feeling guilty that makes it look like I'm writing these, like, you know, the early chapters on your childhood, and there's George's all through this. But I don't want to put it in quotes. I don't want to say George said. So it looks, on the surface, it looks like me. And so I would explain this to George. I'd say, this is a creative problem we're having here. And you just kept putting it back on me, didn't you? You know?
Not my book.
Right.
Not my book.
Right. So in essence, I'm glad you did that. I mean, I think it's
It's the only way it could have worked for two people could not write a book like this. We would have come to blows, or it
Right.
wouldn't have worked.
right. That's interesting.
To tell a story requires a clear voice,
Right.
and it wasn't my voice.
Because you see, that's the irony. My first book was an oral history of 70 different subjective voices from Upper Canada culture. All I did was put a tape recorder down and say, "Talk to me from your subjective reality," and I got off the hook. Right? I just came back. I didn't have to say anything or interpret anything or write anything. That worked for me when I was 40. I think I was still
Yeah.
in that zone, you know. And so the pressure to be an author, your voice, what do you feel right now? Put that on. Try it sometime, because those people show up. Those parents and teacher are in your head. You can't say that.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful, and so that's what artists and writers have to do. You have to fight like hell against that voice, and so you suffer this. It's a kind of, that's the sacrificial role of artists, isn't it? You have to really to speak to the community about everybody's thinking and feeling these things, but you're going to stick your neck out. And I would ask myself, what I would, believe me, I'm not that brave, you know, sort of, why the hell am I doing it? But the act of doing it, and then I think that was the beauty of it, where we were, in a sense, challenging and yet supporting each other at the same time. Like, we're walking off the plank here, but we keep going down deeper and deeper into uncharted waters, and the result is the book. So I'm grateful.
So the ghost of Sally is you really feel her in the book because her letters are there.
Yeah.
Those are her words. And over the course of the 50 years, both of you think about her. I mean, she factors in
And we dreamt about her after her death.
right.
Yeah.
And it influences every other relationship that you might have. Do you ever wonder what if she'd lived? Is that something that you still think about today?
The sheepdog would have been named Petunia. It's that specific. We had our life mapped out. We knew where and when and what and how many kids. So I tried. It's impossible to make yourself forget. I mean, I every device God made that I could think of that would help didn't help. The pain of it finally just kind of set in and never. I mean, this whole exercise has been trolling up a great deal of anguish. So I have no answer for all this. It's just, it's like somebody's sitting on your shoulder who gets smaller and smaller but never goes away.
But do you think you're better for it now? I mean, now that this book
Oh, I
is
thought
out.
it was great then.
Yeah.
I mean, that the trouble with, I'm more complete. I'm a lot more honest with myself. I'm bone honest with the woman I'm in love with. I can actually say stuff like, I'm in love with you in a public environment and not feel shame and stupidity and guilt. I can own my feelings. So that was the value in me for this, was I got to meet me and think, well, he's not a bad guy. He's warts and all, he's what it is. And something I have actually discovered in the last little while is I no longer fear death. I know for most of the time since then, I worked hard to assume I was going to live to 130. I actually told people I'm working on 130. I went on a diet so I could live longer. And in the last little while, I think partially through this exercise, the notion that someday I will pass doesn't hold any weight over me anymore. You know, I've had a good life. I've had an interesting life. I'm in a book. I have a ton of interesting friends. I'm content, and that finally came. I'm not healed. I'm content.
There's a line at the end of the book, James, where I don't think I'm giving anything away. At the end of the book, you write a letter to Sally,
Yes.
and there's a line in there that you say, writing this book, you thought initially that the act of writing this book would have finished her off in your mind and so forth, but you tell her in this letter that it finished you off as a writer.
Yeah.
Does that mean you'll never write again?
Certainly not a book. The 3 books I've written have demanded so much of me emotionally. They've all been epics and challenged me at such a powerful level. And I think I'm tapped out on the themes that I want to say that I've outlined. That I think I've certainly in the form of a book. That's over. I think I can imagine shorter forms or podcasts or filmmaking or something new. That's what I'm looking forward to. You know, as I said earlier, it's something I didn't get to speak as a child, so this is very liberating. I love this. And that's the irony that George showed me. George was gravitated to this very early, right? Like that this was part of the trauma, that here is George as a 10-year-old knows exactly what he wants to be when he grows up, which is how many people can do that. He's 10. I want to be that guy on the radio, right?
This has nothing to do with the book. When I was 17 years old, the editors of the Toronto Star, the Toronto Telegram, and the Toronto Globe and Mail would go to the Royal York Hotel and drink from midnight till 1 on CBC radio, and they would talk about the news of the day. And when I was 17, I would steal my parents' car, drive from North York to the Royal York Hotel, and sit in that room and watch these men. And these were the grand men of journalism in Canada. They were the gatekeepers. And I got to sit in a room with them and watch this, and I thought I was in heaven. And I knew then that's what I wanted to do.
And so that view onto journalism as salvation, I mean, you felt that in terms of journalism, broadcast,
Yeah.
Radio and TV, and then
Yeah.
you as a writer. Is there something instructive in the act of writing itself that you might suggest to someone else that they might find the same, solace is the right word?
One of the opening lines I have in the last book was, all writers write for their mothers. Now that's reductionistic, of course, but there's a really powerful element to that, I think, that you're speaking to the original person, you came out of her body and you're babbling to her and you're creating language, and what are you trying to say and what are you trying to reach? And that's, I think, at the core of that, yeah. But I don't necessarily, there's a danger of saying that all writing has this quality, but a lot of it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm obviously of a different generation than these two guys.
Yeah.
So I'm reading the book and I'm thinking this is a good way to understand, say, my parents. Future generations might read this and wonder if this is a good way to understand their grandparents. When you're writing this, James, do you have that in mind?
Yeah. I have a hard time separating out myself from, because of my own particular history, and to generalize from that, right? Because I was in such a extreme, only now do I can understand this and talk about this, right? That I was in a black hole. It's not too extreme an expression. That as a child, my life was at risk, and that speaking, it's right out of, it's like that child in The Shining, that there's no voice, and you're traumatized from a very early age, and the actual act of finding one's voice first before you even write anything. So I'm just one of those guys. So that this is an extreme. Not all writers are like this, of course. There's all kinds of lovely people who are balanced and healthy and happy, who are excellent writers and don't have to have all this trauma to generate their stories,
But you are better for it, though, right?
But, well, that's the thing, I think. But I would also say that the essential, I don't think I could have done it just by writing.
And you couldn't have done it, say, 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
That's right.
It had to be 50 years.
When I was 40 and my first book was an oral history, I didn't have the ego strength to write anything yet. I hadn't yet had my voice. And the thing that changed me was going into a really wonderful relationship with a brilliant depth psychotherapist who many years of just in the trenches, finally finding my physical voice in my chest, and to connect with my body and my feelings and come out of a trance and not reenact this, the whole thing about upper gynecology, go into the family business. In my case, the family business is suicide. And I didn't realize yet how, because I hadn't unpacked the suicide stories yet, because they were all denied. So I was on a suicidal path without even knowing it, or certainly denying it. And so it was whatever instinct was in me to survive and keep going was, I suppose, books, because I was introverted and inside myself, so I would read. I'd come into places like this and lose myself. I think a lot of writers do. You read a lot first, and then I didn't know that I had a gift or a potential gift. I still have a problem seeing myself as a gifted writer. People tell me this, that I'm so self-critical. And the painstaking act of putting sentences together, and then stepping back and seeing what you've created, I've had to rely on other people to tell me. It's almost that.
Well, what did your editor say at Random House as you were writing this? What did they give you any encouragement as to what you'd written so far?
I was blessed that Anne Collins is this remarkable woman, born on a farm, no private school, no baggage, lovely, integrated, down to earth, amazing person, utterly ruthless in terms of editing, and yet she loves you. She cares, and I felt that she loves me and she cares about me. And she put up with my overwriting and going off in 19 directions, being perfectionistic and having to nail every last story down, because that's where the position I was coming from as a writer. No one's listening to me. It's my mother. I'm in the silence. I'm alone in a room. I'm crying and no one is coming. And how do you find words for that? Because it's the primal scream under there. And so putting together the perfect British sentence, maybe she'll love me if I put together a really powerful book and she'll respond to me. And she never did. And in fact, she undermined when I became an author, it was like, who cares? So what? Big deal, big shot. Because she was a thwarted writer and artist herself, right? So she treated me like a sibling, like a rivalrous sibling. And so she wasn't going to let me realize my gift the way her father wouldn't let her realize her gift. She passionately, like you, she was very young, and she wanted to go to the Slade School of Art. She had gifts. My mother was a dynamic, amazing, beautiful, educated woman, and she was crushed by this. And that's her tragedy, that she didn't find a way to fight her way out of that. And this is the 1930s, of course. This is pre-feminism, and she didn't have any other support systems to help her realize her true self. And so she took it out on herself and the rest of us, her frustration with us and my father, and the collapse. When he breaks up, she's enraged, and when he breaks into pieces, you've betrayed me. So it's so powerful. It's out of Eugene O'Neill, And so sounds glib too, but the 60s came along at the right time for me.
Oh, yeah.
So this, all of a sudden, the rules have changed, and I think I would have been doomed if there had, all of a sudden it's okay to question.
If the 1950s had gone on and on, then I wouldn't have stuck around.
It would have been, yeah. It was propitious. So born at the right time in some ways. All this terrible stuff happened, but thank God that all these liberation movements are suddenly happening. And so this is the irony. Here's a white privileged male identifying with the underclass and blacks and liberation movements, and I know what they, at some level, feel like.
What, George, do you want, say, your kids or your grandkids to get out of this book about you and your parents even?
I wanted my kids to grow up without having to go through therapy, really. Like, I started out fathering the way I was fathered, which was, I think, pretty brutal. A sharp temper, a lot of judgments, just an angry man, trying to be nice. I finally apologized to my two older kids profusely and said, I'm sorry. That guy's gone. get on with your life, embrace life, be yourself, enjoy life, take a deep breath, do something stupid. The daughter is going to have a baby in a couple of months. We haven't met the dad. Well, we met him once. He's a lovely guy, I'm told. If this had happened a generation ago, the daughter would have been shamed, and it would have been brutal and horrible, and what are you doing with your life, and how dare you? And now with this generation in our family, it's great. It's going to be a baby. It'll be a boy. It'll be fantastic. I'll get to bounce him on my knee. There are no more judgments. There's no, that overburden that represented that era. It may not be gone, but it's certainly gone out of my life. Took great effort to get the hell rid of it. And so I say this in some jest, but my kids won't have to go through therapy to put me aside. They get to be whoever the hell they want, and they're really doing well at it. So I'm happy.
Yeah, the boomers were better parents, generally speaking, I think. Yeah. But what needs to be said too, I think, in terms of, because when I told, in a short version of, people ask me what's the book about, and I tell them, you sense a lot of people saying, so why didn't he get over it? Like, get over it. The get over it culture. They're puzzled why we're sitting here 50 years later talking about the death of an 18-year-old girl. And that's why I did the book, to unpack the subtleties and nuances, and wait a minute, it is such a knee-jerk culture, and especially with men, and that we really have to look deeper at these things and be more forgiving of each other. And what wasn't said, that, back to George wanting to go into radio when he was 10, and this unyielding, callous attitude of his parents, which I identified with his story, was, that George finally at 16 had the strength, the muster to say to them, why are you spending money sending me to a school that I hate? And the dropped cutlery and to radically disown him on the spot. It's like saying he wanted to be a drug dealer to become a journalist. You want to go to Ryerson, a polytechnic. He doesn't want to go to Harvard. He doesn't want to become prime minister. Like, we're grooming him to become in our own, They didn't ask him what he wanted to do. And this is what this is still going on, isn't it? It's remarkable that the parents living this with their children, we're gonna turn you into something that we want you to be, rather than listening to the child, and their own inherent gifts will emerge, right, if you let them. And then support that. I mean, it's extraordinary. And so this double trauma that George had was, he didn't have to move out, but almost, right? And then Sally's killed on top of this. And the response when he comes home to walk into the living room, and his parents are sitting there, and he says, Sally is dead. And they were fond of her. And I mean, when you first told me that, I couldn't believe it, and then I could believe it. Zero, literally not capable of responding. Nothing. Stare at you. And that's my parents too. And then we have a smaller version. When I went around and interviewed everybody in the Odyssey, there was perhaps not as extreme of that, but I remember Nan corroborated this, that a lot of our parents were just World War II generation, were just this emotional, because a lot of them have been traumatized in the war, right? And
I think the strength of a story like this is you have captured a time that was a real time in this country, that was every day is a pivot point, but this was a time and a place where people lived in a certain way that they took for granted, that is now an artifact. And when we live in our time and our place, we think this is kind of how it is, how it'll always be. Well, it won't be like this. And so the work of somebody like him is to capture that in amber, through a narrative, through a tragedy, because it amplifies everything. And to explore the characters, and through the characters get a sense of what that place was like and what that time was like. Because 20 years from then, it has no value. But 100 years from now, this will be a lens through which we can look back at Canada and what it was through a story. And that's the value of a piece like this.
And as I said a moment ago, I'm of a different generation than these two guys, but it's taught me a number of things, especially the language that guys should use, not only amongst themselves, but amongst society writ large. I have about half a dozen questions left. But
I got lots of answers.
Do you? Yeah. Well, that's what lunch is like with him. If any of you have questions, just put up your hand and we'll take them, because I think this is a great chance to get to talk to these two guys and about that remarkable time 50 years ago. If anyone's got a question?
This is Canada, so nobody has the first question, everybody has the second.
I'll answer
Yes.
the question. I understand that it's, you know, it's an historic piece and that it has sociological and psychological and historical relevance. But I also feel like the material around first love and the tenderness of a young man's heart and the vulnerability, I think that's universal actually. And it's so sensitively and deeply exposed in this book. And I wonder if Canada's ready for that. You know, I really do wonder. Just wonder if either of you have any
That's an
sense of
excellent
that.
observation. Yeah.
That was my trepidation in getting involved with this. Like, you know, everybody relates. The time at which you just go head over heels and you think, oh my God, what am I doing? What has happened to me? And then to share it. I mean, the commitment I made to him was I would be completely honest about that stuff in a way that I don't think I would ever think of doing outside of that. Definitely not with my kids. I mean, parents are parents. But yeah, I had that experience, and I had the blessing of being able to live through it again through this exercise. And it's terribly painful, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
I had another epiphany among many that the environment I grew up in, and that the school training and maledom and everything, and that there's a tenderness taboo and a vulnerability taboo, and particularly among males, and this shaming, and that I realized that you can't love anybody unless you're vulnerable. It's sort of a very simple equation, right? It's a risk. If you actually love somebody, you know, it's a whole new set of rules. And we're growing up in a world where this is sort of almost systematically programmed to eradicate this.
Yeah.
That we're doing you a favor, right? The big, bad, rough world out there, we're going to protect you from having to feel any of that stuff. And it reached its peak in the 50s and 60s. All of a sudden, the boomers come along, and the big great refusal, no, and all that primitive and passionate music, and this powerful reaction to it. And then it's in turn clamped down, right, by Reagan and Nixon, and they're terrified. The boomers were this, you know, huge generation demographically that could do that. It was just an eruption of passion, right? And a lot of mistakes made, of course, and naivete. But I had to fight this. That I realized I've been so programmed that I get it now. Upper Canada College is a loveless institution. There's brilliance, there's glamour, there's intelligence, there's all these power, achievement, very impressive. I interviewed 300 of them. You know, I had a lot of admiration for a lot of these guys, a lot of decency in there, but a lot of pathology and tragedy and suicide and madness, and it's all quietly ignored. And this is, as you see in the media today, right? Like the last few days has been this blanket coverage of St. Michael's College. That's Upper Canada College. They're next. They've already had their turn. It's coming back. Believe me, there's more coming. There's waves of this now. Me Too for the male side, right? Like, it's all been, this reckoning is happening now. This is what's exciting.
There's a question there, go ahead.
I just wanted to tell you something. I have a good friend I went to school with. We're not great friends, but we've kept a friendship. He owns the Canadian Stock Exchange.
Somebody has to.
That's it, that's how it still works.
It's from the point of view of someone who was on that trip with you.
Yes.
The people in the room might be quite interested to hear that for 50 years we've been dealing with how poorly Sally's death was handled.
Yes.
This is, it's just still is unbelievable to us who were with her and experienced this
That's right.
trauma and this tragedy. It was incredible how poorly it was handled. We weren't told the truth at the outset, and then eventually we were told that she had died. There was
We weren't
no
allowed to go to her funeral. We didn't go to her
Right.
funeral.
And there were no communication with parents. I grew up in Ottawa, and we knew cousins of Sally's, and so my parents were very aware of her name. And they read her death notice in the Globe and Mail, and that was the first inkling they had that someone on the trip where I was had died, and it was, you can imagine, shocking. And another girl tells me how her parents were driving in Toronto on the 401, I think, and heard it on the radio.
Heard on the radio, yeah.
So there was, and of course, we were just expected to carry on for about 2 weeks.
Keep calm and carry on.
Yes,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, what would it be like? There'd be grief counselors. We would have been flown home immediately.
They probably overkill in the opposite
Yes,
direction.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah. I know, it's a real comment on the times and, yeah.
Can I just,
Some sense of context. My dad at 20 years old was on the North Atlantic killing people. So he came home, his dad too, they came home from the war, those people. You know, the trauma they had endured is inconceivable. So the way they parented was the best that they had given what they had to work with. So, you know, and so they had no emotional tools. Like my parents were burned off emotionally to the nub before they were out of their teenage years. They had no capability in that regard. So it's not like they were willingly doing something bad with us. They just had no idea. Like, what do you do when somebody dies?
Arrested.
You make a casserole. That's what you do. You give somebody a casserole and say, wish there was more I could do. The world has changed greatly, and I think we're all much better off for the change of the world. But it's not like back then they were evil. They just had no tools.
Yeah.
The other thing I was wondering about, because he's obviously involved in the story, other people who were, who knew what happened 50 years ago, what have they thought of the book?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We had a wonderful launch in September with 150 people, and 15 of the people on the Odyssey were there, and Nan flew out. And so it's been generally a kind of, as I said, it was like a guilt trip turned into a love-in, you know. It's like, that's what I found during the book. There was a lot of guilt, and irrational guilt that people were carrying. You know, if only I had intervened, I could have saved Sally's life. I mean, it's amazing what people project onto situations, you know. And the leader of the trip, the student leader, couldn't come to the launch because he finally had the strength to email me and say, I felt responsible for Sally's death. He was 24 years old. He was not responsible for Sally's death. But he feels that to this day. And so there was this kind of group therapy aspect of the book, you know, I call it therajournalism, you know, where we explore this and say, no, like, we're all off the hook here, you know. Like, I mean, we all feel, we feel this stuff intensely, we have to respect this, it's not going to disappear, but we're doing this, aren't we? I mean, this does help. And so to answer your question, there was a mixed, but largely positive. I mean, I know my books stir people up, because you know, I was stirred up.
Are there any more questions? I figure if you want to buy a copy, you can get James to sign it.
Yes, I'd love to sign it.
In a few minutes, and they'll both be around to answer any of the questions you might have. Yes?
I just wonder if you might read a little bit of it for us.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Anybody got a copy?
I have mine in the back there.
Silent to read.
Oh, by the way, while you find a portion to read,
Yes.
there's an audiobook, I understand.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. And so there's an actor that reads the author's part, if you will, the narrator,
Yeah.
and then there are two other people that play George and Sally. Is that right?
oh yeah,
That's
Have
right.
you heard it?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's very jarring.
Is it?
Yeah, because I listened to it on an airplane coming back from Toronto, and I'm hearing me. I'm hearing my words and me, but it's not me, and I'm hearing her, and I'm thinking it's. Audiobooks are very compelling.
Yeah,
You know,
We're all listening to them now that I think
Yeah.
that. But I do suggest you pick up the book at the door there, because I got something out of it, and I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm 36. I'm not of their generation, but it's taught me a lot about my parents. But anyway, James.
I'll just read the short section where George has the dream.
why not go for it?
On Christmas night, 1967, George was, as usual, invited to the Woodhouse family dinner. But as he scanned Sally's family members taking their set places at the polished rosewood dining room table, he felt his distance from their circle and the class codes conducted with such symphonic seamlessness. Here was the gilded box that to his eyes increasingly resembled a coffin. Here was the rarefied heaven on earth his mother so unambiguously wanted for him. But did Sally want it too? As George sipped the cold vichyssoise from the monogrammed sterling silver spoon, he wondered how long before he would need the same spoon to tunnel out of prison. We're stand-up tragedians, right? That's the line. The question gnawed, do I belong here? Past midnight, George and Sally ascended the staircase and lingered in each other's arms on the threshold of the second-floor guest bedroom. After Sally broke off their kiss, he watched her slip away into the darkness to her bedroom on the floor above. In the dawn light of Boxing Day, he was jolted awake by a dream of primal intensity. As the phantasm of faces and voices melted away, he was left with a single thought drumming his head. Sally will die in Europe this summer. Over breakfast, he could not help telling Sally the dream. As he watched her face fall, he knew he should back off, but instead found himself begging her to drop out of the Odyssey. She was bewildered, then creeped out, then irritated. For weeks, he had been badgering her not to go, and now he was pulling this stunt? Undeterred, George told the dream to his parents, Sally's parents, his friends, to anyone who would listen. Sally will die in Europe this summer. Almost to a person, the response came back. Get over it. She loves you. The dream is just a dream.
This passage that you chose reminded me of something in the book, and there's a lot of these coincidences that happen. This dream that George has is a premonition, obviously. Do you think that this comes from, I don't know, the faith, because you're of a generation that probably turned away, I should say, from organized religion. Do you think that this spirituality, if you will, fills that void?
That's an excellent question. I think I'm sort of slowly evolving in that direction. I mean, I say at one point, like, I've had so many synchronistic experiences before, during, and after. I mean, this is the whopper, but they've been generated, I think, by the book writing, and that was one of the first questions I had for George. Does this happen to you all often? Dreaming these things, and it was a one-off for you, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas I have been either gifted or cursed by having multiple. I have a cabinet full of them, and so what does this mean? I mean, it's a mystery ultimately. But I think my stance is, because of coming from a family of scientists, where again this rigidity and knee-jerk reaction stuff is like, you're crazy if you take any of this seriously, or this, like, you get pathologized very quickly. And so as an artist, I push back on this. And I'm not saying I'm trying to convert people to a religion of synchronicity, but it's a phenomenon. Mm-hmm. It's a phenomenon. It's a fascinating phenomenon. It exists in the world. I read 30 books on the subject. It's fascinating if you take the time. Quantum mechanics and the unconscious mind, and it's what the human mind is capable of, potentially. And the idea that we're evolving, that the human personality and brain and generations, that our generation hopefully is a leap forward, and the next one hopefully is, and the children are inherently more brilliant than we are, and they're the next generation, and let them be brilliant. And so that's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, why are we grooming and keeping down these wonderful, amazing creatures, right, that are going to take us to the next level? And so we need science, as you know, is there's an imbalance between science and art, right? We need more art.
And both can explain so much of us.
Yeah, that's right. And not to be afraid of it. I think that's the thing, that I want to challenge that voice. And I haven't had this conversation yet. I haven't been in a room full of scientists yet. But I would love to take on some people who say, James, you know, you're out of your mind, or, you know, you're a flake, or you're stupid, or you're shallow to take any of this seriously. And my response would be, well, I'm not trying to convert. It's not like I'm selling some kind of certainty to you. You guys do that. You're the guys who believe in certainty. Science is some kind of tool of certainty. It's not true. It's not. It's as ephemeral as anything else. You know. So that's the conversation that may yet happen. You know.
Anyone else have a question? If not, well, I think we'll wrap things up, and then you can
I'd
go
love
up to the
to,
front
yeah.
and sign copies of the book for folks.
Okay.
I have
Yes,
just
please.
a little
Yeah.
observation, it's not a question. I'd just like to thank you both for your courage.
Oh, thank you.
And thank all of you for coming out
Yes.
tonight.
Yes, thank you for coming.
It's been a pleasure to meet you, and it's good to see you again. I'm sure we'll talk again. Thank you all, and thank you to Patricia and Massy Books for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good.